which doesn't seem to be the case. There we go. Okay. And the chat is over here. All right, welcome everybody to today's episode of Coffee, Kegs, and Kriegsspiel, the podcast of the International Kriegsspiel Society. And I guess if you're listening, you already know the IKS. If not, please visit kriegsspiel.org to find out more about the society and an invite link to our Discord server, which has by now over 1,000 members. Okay, I'm here today with Whisper and Otto to talk about interesting topics, I think. First, we're gonna start talking about how to approach system design for Kriegsspiel, because that might be interesting for many of our members, as we have quite a lot of members who are coming up with their own systems, starting their own campaigns and games and whatnot. So some insights into how you approach system design, and then maybe also scenario design, but let's focus on system design first. And I would like to have Whisper give us some impressions, because I know you're pretty new to developing or designing Kriegsspiel systems. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I started playing Kriegspiel around when the Grand Gettysburg scenario was played and streamed, um, or at least the first one anyway. And I've been a player pretty much up until about 2 months ago, where I started thinking, man, it seems like turns take a while to go through for the umpires. Um, like, what's a way we can like get through everything faster, and still like retain the feeling of whatever era or conflict or scenario we wanted to achieve, right?
Mm-hmm.
um, and it kind of developed into looking at modern rule sets, mostly because and this is just anecdotal, I don't have like hard numbers or anything, but it seems like there was a niche to fill there wasn't a common rule set that a lot of people use. Like Otto happens to be here. His system is, as I understand it, is pretty common um, for just line infantry warfare. Like if we want to generalize super strongly, um, and there didn't exist an equivalent for modern stuff. At the same time, you also didn't see a ton of games in like the modern era, which in this case, I'm considering from like the 50s onto the present day. Um, so it just seemed like a neat niche to fill, a fun, like we can brew up some fun scenarios, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how did you sort of approach the system design? Did you sort of base it on what you had experienced as a player, or?
Yes. So first was seeing how the other umpires had been doing it, and looking at how video games do it, which I don't know if it's like a grave sin or not, but things like the operational art of war and things such as combat mission and flashpoint campaigns. Um, those three games are like really big sources for, man, like what would a modern like rule set need to like model, and how do they do it? Um, so what I've discovered is that it's very difficult. It's exponentially like more complex than say like World War II combat. You have systems that can hit from like hundreds of kilometers away. You have a lot of very complicated aircraft systems, very advanced radar. Your Even like the way infantry fights has like changed since World War II to adapt to like these new hyper lethal platforms. Um, and I'm not even gonna bother yet with like jumping into how naval warfare has changed. So approaching it is basically reading up what I can find, what I can grab, and making sure that ranges line up, trying to find different like after action reports if they're publicly available, or even heck combat footage or like written experiences from people who have seen modern combat. I mean, my father was a Cav scout in the Cold War, sitting there across the Fulda Gap from the Soviets, and he's honestly like one of my sources. I ask him all sorts of stuff about, hey, like, well, how did you guys like set up, and what were like the expectations for like what combat would look like for you? And it's not like he's my sole one, but he's a funny one to bring up.
Mm-hmm. Ah, cool. That's great. Okay, and Otto, you have been working on different systems for a while now. Most popular, already mentioned the Otovsky system for Napoleonic warfare. What is your approach to system design?
All right, so well, I can say a lot of the same things that Whisper said. I also kind of looked at what was going on in the community and built some of the things I wanted to be seen in games myself. When I started working on the Napoleonic system, it was quite easy since, in the sense that there were already Napoleon games being held, and I basically could rip off a lot of people's ideas and just change them around a bit. So my favorite way of making a system is basically waiting for the other people to kind of finalize their system so it works quite well, and then I try to make it even better, I like to think. And with systems, I've usually had realism in mind, basically. So that's been always a core thing. And the nice thing about the thing that Napoleonic games were already played here in the community, and there's a lot of history nerds and actual historians in the community, is that I could talk to a lot of the community members and ask them about stuff and what Napoleonic combat should be like, and they could answer any of my questions I had. I remember John, for example, helped me quite a lot answering a lot of my questions and helping me design the system that way. So basically, I just turned the turned the ideas and advice of other people into the game system, and that's what I've been doing with my World War II system as well. Shout out to Glorious Ruse for helping me with learning about World War II combat better.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Yeah, and I think that is certainly a totally valid approach. I mean, the same things is going on in the board game community where people pick up games they like and then they start altering them and changing mechanics and whatnot. And from there new systems are developed and even published as full on commercial games. So yes, and the community, of course, is a great resource to rely on. So okay, let's you both of you have already mentioned the modern aspects, and we've already sort of a vague idea what has changed from World War II to moderns. But let's get a little bit more into detail there, and then maybe this time start with the World War II stuff. I know that Carter has, of course, run his huge D-Day campaign as a play-by-text game, I think that was. And there have been some smaller World War II systems before. Have you taken those into account, Otto, or is this mostly you had an idea of how to do it, and then you exchanged with members and build up from
Yeah,
there?
yeah, I definitely talked to people who had hosted World War II games. Lots of the stuff was quite experimental. No one had, or few people had really written down their system as a guide, really. So there was a lot of talking to the person who made it. I think Spy Pigeon, for example, he hosted a World War II operational game, and I learned basically he faced quite a lot of difficulties there with um, what the players requested as orders and how he didn't simulate, for example, entrenchment for units. So those are big things I then decided to include in my system. So it's great that I could really kind of learn from other people's mistakes and experiences in designing the system.
Yeah, and there's of course Kegs naval World War II stuff also going on, which is of course a completely different story. But just to mention that, and what would you say are the specific requirements for a World War II game system?
If you can give me moderator
Yeah,
quickly,
sure.
I can load up one of the saves, so there's something to look at, and I'll put up okay, game host, there we go. Hopefully that does.
Oh, I can rejoin. It's cool. There we go.
Okay, there we go. Nice. All right, I'm going to load up quickly one of the end games here. Oh, this is actually not just, and this is quite close to the end, but it's not literally the end. So about World War II, where to even start? Basically, first thing I needed to decide was what level I want my games to be at. So Carter, for example, had hosted the D-Day games, and he basically had the smallest unit piece be a company. Meanwhile, in my system, I wanted to similar to my Napoleonic system in the sense that I really like the low-level stuff. I like that one of the commanders is there leading on the front lines, where the rest of the well, they might have a higher up commander who is giving them orders, and they are more behind the front lines. So that's why I decided to do regiment size battles, basically. So each unit here is a platoon, and this is, well, not a regiment size battle. This is more of a reinforced battalion versus a one battalion here. But with World War II, the big thing was controlling units is quite different from Napoleonics. For example, in my Napoleonic system, you are moving out battalions, but in modern combat, there's a lot of stuff that only even just small units can do. So, for example, well, here company commanders can give quite specific orders to their platoons, and of course, the lethality of combat is quite interesting as well. And regarding to that as well, there is more variance in modern combat. For example, you can do quite a lot of damage with just one platoon which is entrenched. So there's a lot of things like artillery and armor and suppression that all come in. And yes, it's quite difficult to start with because we are comparing over 100 years of change with this World War II and Napoleonic systems.
Yeah, absolutely. What I find interesting is maybe that's a thing that can be compared. What about morale in these sort of battles? Do you think that's different? Has a different impact on overall combat development?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I did want to include morale in my games a lot, and some of the things could carry over from Napoleonic games. Like if you have your right flank of your army falter, usually your whole army will falter. So there's a lot of people still are scared when they see enemy troops emerging right in their rear. So there's a lot of things you can carry over to the system as an umpire, and there's a lot of umpire discretion among those things. There's also historical stuff, like on the Eastern Front, the performance difference between a Soviet infantry platoon versus a German infantry platoon early in the war is quite different, thanks to how the German junior officers and the platoons are trained, with emphasis on initiative and small unit tactics. Meanwhile, the Soviets are more centralized. So there's a lot of historical things you can bring into the system, and I do have that worked in with disruption modifiers, which maybe I will cover the system in more detail in a later Coffee, Kegs, and Kriegsspiel episode.
Sure. Okay, and are you planning to also sort of write it down the system and make it available?
Yeah, definitely. I've already hosted 2 School of the Empire sessions about the system, and I've been working on a document, but mostly it's right now just notes for me. I'm still working on the document. And the system itself. So as you can see, not the dice. They don't even have any graphics on them. They're just numbers currently. So I have yet to finalize things, and I am very much working on the system. I've been asking players about feedback a lot, and I've especially been talking to some people in the community who know much more about World War II combat than me, and I've gotten some great ideas for the system and the dice that way.
Cool. Okay, and I know that Whisper has also started more rigid testing, so to say. But one aspect that also sort of is a good connection, I think, between the two periods. What about communication systems? Because when we think about the classical Kriegsspiel, of course, Napoleonic stuff, dispatches are being sent back and forth. Now we have field telephones, radios. How do you handle that? Is there still sort of a delay in communications, or how does it work?
Oh wait, was that a question for me?
Yeah,
or
that's for
which?
you. That's for you.
Okay. Yeah, in World War II, definitely, it's a huge, very interesting aspect of the Eastern Front is especially the like I said, and the difference between Soviet and German forces. So yes, you mentioned runners. Usually the Soviet commanders are mostly reliant on runners. Meanwhile, all of the German commanders have radios which they can use to communicate with each other and with their platoons. So the difference between a unit in how they get their orders and how the players themselves can communicate to each other much faster is quite staggering and interesting difference. And also you have field telephones as well, which can be overrun and also restrict the player to stay in one place if you want to talk to another player. So there's a lot of variance in modern combat, definitely.
Yeah, and I think that is, and now let's switch over to the Cold War stuff, or even more modern stuff. That's also a big thing in the more recent periods, right? When all digital sort of communications come in and electronic warfare and all that stuff. Do you take those things into account, Whisper?
Yeah, absolutely. You still have things like field telephone lines. They're just not as common with, say, like the U.S. Army in Iraq or in a like an occupation scenario. But for operational warfare, having like secure communications is always going to be critical. In worst case, you can run people with a handwritten message over, or even just verbal orders. But yeah, you have digital and radio communications that are pretty powerful, that include like encryption, even nowadays, allowing communication to be instantaneous. One thing that's majorly different, other than like the speed and security of that communication, or even just having two machines talk to each other to transfer information. One big difference between uh, current or present day warfare versus World War II warfare is that the prevalence of radios has just skyrocketed. For the U.S. Army, you have radios all the way down to like squad level. Um, so it allows those formations to be hyper flexible, and able to respond to different new situations. By the same token, having all that cut away means you are reduced back to either World War II or worse, like communication styles where you're running those messages, or relying on field telephones where it's basically just a physical line running from one phone to another, however many hundreds of yards or meters.
All right. Maybe we can switch over to a save of yours, and you show us a little bit of your system. Otto, if you
Yeah.
can promote, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. I think you can load from games, one of your saves.
Well, you are a player in one of them,
Yeah.
so I'll have to use a slightly older one.
By the way, Whisper, do you then, with your scenarios on Modern Combat games, do you usually, is it conventional warfare or unconventional warfare?
So far, since I'm still developing the rule set, it's been a focus on conventional or near peer warfare. Just simply because unconventional warfare requires like special rules and such to like get through, in my opinion. Yeah. But yeah, this is one of the middle states of Zephyr Lightning, um, where Red 4 and Blue 4 are just about to meet. The scenario is basically there's a crash site over here. They're trying to secure it and find a missing VIP and extract him. That's Blue 4's objective. Red has the exact same objective, but for their own purposes. It's not their guy. They want to take him and interrogate him. This is all the just a stand-up like set piece scenario where it's just like a company plus worth of like people on either side. Blue 4 has fewer, but it's different like equipment systems. So one thing that I had to problem solve for that I didn't realize I didn't have rules for is smoke and how that obscures.
Mm-hmm.
So nowadays you have optics, not just night vision, but also thermal, that allow people to peer through normal types of smoke. So I went down a rabbit hole reading all about the different kinds of smoke that are used by especially like NATO forces, but looking back even to the 80s, it hasn't changed too much for the smoke. You can have like smoke grenades or smoke deployments that the gas that's being emitted is a little bit hotter, so it actually obscures thermal vision. I also learned some fun facts about like the range of thermal vision. It's actually not as far as you might think. Um, like for instance, the modern like thermal optics, at least according to like public information that the Russians are using in Ukraine, have about 1,500 to 2,000 meter like range before it just becomes too um, obscured, I guess, because it's not only seeing any hot body, it's seeing all of the particles, and all of those particles have like temperatures. So after a certain amount of distance, it just becomes diffused, and you can't really make out much. For uh, Western equipment, specifically like the U.S. Army, they can extend it out a little bit more, it seems. But they both have this like hard problem with thermal optics more than a couple kilometers away, assuming everything's under like ideal conditions. You can't see through tree trunks, you can't see through the ground. Yeah. So that's one way warfare has changed a lot. And I think I've wandered off the beaten track and I don't quite remember the original question. I'm so sorry.
That's all right, no worries. From playing Flashpoint campaigns, I have the impression that if we are talking about like sort of Cold War era stuff, then there's quite a huge difference in technological standards. So the Warsaw Pact is quite a bit behind and sort of trying to overwhelm the enemy in close range with their numbers, so to say, and try to prevent the NATO forces from employing their technological advantage in ranged engagements. Is that a thing? You mentioned that the Blue 4 here had fewer forces. Do you think that adds an interesting asymmetrical dimension to these sort of conflicts or combats, or how do you approach that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're just going to focus on the 80s in particular, That is roughly the decade in which the technological advantage actually swapped from the Soviets to the Western powers. Um, Funny note, like prior to that, prior to the Western powers having like superior optics and like starting to get some real equipment out in the field and in numbers, the Soviet like T-64, for instance, was considered a beast of a tank. It had a more powerful muzzle velocity, so it could like hit things at a flat trajectory from further away. Could take shots itself, and the Soviets just had so many of them. It was pretty crazy. So the T-64 was considered the thing that would have busted through like the Fulda Gap or other places along the front. And in the 80s, what you saw is that the Western powers started investing more in not just their aircraft systems, and like their strategic level like options, but the tactical options. And they took a lot of notes out of the German playbook. And this is where I'm straying from like a historian will probably know better, or someone who lived through it like an actual expert. Me as like a fan of history, just reading through things, I might be getting this wrong. But my perception is they were taking a note out of the German World War II playbook of enabling more so like their lower level non-commissioned officers to uh, take charge, take leadership roles, and operate in smaller and smaller groups with the idea of a defense in depth or an elastic defense, where yeah, if the Soviets punch through, all you need to do is buy time, because you can fly from the United States in particular and Canada, um, troops over to equip themselves and then go to the front and meet the Soviets head on without having to have a standing army like the Soviets did, just sitting in Europe, like millions of them.
Hmm.
Um, and doing that kind of defense depth and elastic defense, I think is probably more accurate. Um, Means that units that are expecting to take heavy casualties in the opening moments of a war need to be able to operate with whoever's left. That's why they empowered those non-commissioned officers and started giving more powerful singular systems with longer ranges and good optics, so that they could have that standoff distance from onrushing Soviet Union units. Um, so it's definitely fascinating. It fascinated generals from like the 70s on until the end of the Cold War, in the 90s. And it's something that you definitely see still today. I don't think that that spirit of like training US soldiers to take initiative and like be leaders in their own right, it's almost like expected of them. Whereas like in an Eastern pattern formation, so not just the Soviets, but you can see this in like the Middle East, like Iraq, for instance, you need an officer there to dictate to like platoon level or higher units to like go and do things. Your non-commissioned officers, the cadre may or may not exist, but like the officer is ultimately who's making all of the tactical decisions rather than the sergeant on the ground who can see
Hmm.
things. I hope that made sense.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Okay, as we are sort of running out of time, I want to invite the folks in the chat. If you have any questions, please post them now. And I want to ask you two, what do you think, just to sort of circle back to the beginning, what are the biggest challenges for you when working on your systems or starting to work on new systems and developing them? Otto, maybe you go first.
Hmm. Well, actually, Whisper, do you have an answer ready? Cause
yeah.
go
Um,
ahead.
the way I approach it, and like how difficult it is I just do as much reading as I possibly can. So i you have a lot of different systems all meshing together in post 1950s, 1960s combat where ranges can vary a lot. You have like the combined arms thing just becomes common across every doctrine. Um, so like the scenario that I have loaded up here, the big thing was that, or one of my prime focuses was that Blue 4 was going to have access to javelins, which can strike multiple kilometers away. They just need line of sight, essentially, to simplify it a lot. They take like an electro-optical image, copy that down, and then like that missile, quote unquote, remembers it whenever you fire it, and then the Javelin team can run away. It's pretty discreet. It's pretty lethal because it's a top attack profile spiking down into like the softer top side. And that was going to be a huge advantage that Blue 4 had, aside from like the Abrams versus like a T-80. On the flip side, the Soviet, or the I shouldn't say Soviet, the Red 4 was going to have a lot of Soviet-style equipment where if they can get close, they will just absolutely overwhelm Blue 4 as long as they can close the distance. And they also have some long-range options of their own. They have like artillery. Mass artillery is a big part of Soviet doctrine. And those assets were given to Red 4 in this scenario as well. The idea is to prepare the ground, rush over it, and then like complete your objectives. Whatever losses you take. And that's part of why these formations are so big on the Eastern style units. So it's a lot of reading of like, okay, this system is meant to counter this, or it's meant to do these kinds of things at this range, and was like this effective when tested, and so on. It's difficult, and I miss a lot. It's almost impossible to read everything.
Yeah, sure, for sure. Okay, Otto, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, so my answer to the question, what I find most difficult in designing the system is, well, with modern combat, I am trying to simulate regiment versus regiment size battles at their largest, but the players only command a company each, meaning they command platoons. So there's a lot of things that I'm trying to include in the system. I'm trying to have all this infantry combat going around with all of their variables, the varying levels of entrenchment and the terrain and the experience of the troops and if they are disordered or well organized. And then at the same time, I also need to at some point include tanks, and and they have different varying qualities. And then I have artillery in the game as well right now, and it can vary in effectiveness and in weight class. So there's a lot of things I need to include, and I still want in the system for just a infantry company versus infantry company action to still be fun. So it's hard to balance all of that together. And one of the most difficult things I find, especially in World War II, is when making the system is trying to, so to say, balance realism and real life, because in real life there are tales of how a few dozen soldiers have held off hundreds of enemy soldiers just by holding an entrenched position or something like that, and I'm not sure how to incorporate that into the dice without making the players want to leave the game halfway.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I'm personally thinking about, and that is for mostly for Napoleonic combat, about a sort of a deck of cards of random events, and then under certain conditions you pull them, or you draw a card, and then this sort of special outcome can be included in those. But yeah, I see your point that it's difficult to, if you have a sort of odds-based die roll mechanic, to include the sort of radical outcome, so to say. Yeah, okay, very interesting. Thanks a lot to both of you for these insights, and thanks a lot for everybody in the chat. That was another episode of Coffee, Cracks, and Kriegsspiel.